I'm going to go a little bit at a fast pace, and I hope you follow. But yeah, I wanted to show this video to you, and I am not going to do it because we really don't have the time. But it doesn't matter, I'll tell you about it, and I am sure many of you have been here. This is a design page, the design node, where you put all your configurations. And this one in particular, it's around 2,000 lines of code. And yeah, who feels responsible for this? Whoever touches this? You? You? Raul? So you're working a bit in the middle end, right? In my opinion, this is, if I ask who is accountable for this, who's responsible for this, many times we come to the conclusion that, yeah, you're telling your colleagues, it's your work, you're a backend, it's yours, it's your frontend, and this is your components configuration, and you do it, no, I do it, no. Okay, it's a middle end, right? And in the middle end, many things happen. You have data validation, you have data formatting, you have, I don't know, layout and templating, and you have component configuration, right? And in this node, what we could see is that basically we have configuration switches coming from page properties, we have client libraries defined, we have the allowed components that are meant to be in the hierarchy of the parses. We have the default configuration for those components. So, yeah, like I said, thousands of lines of code dedicated to accomplishing very different things in just one file. And nobody really feeling accountable for it, or many people feeling accountable for it. I don't know. So especially when it comes to component configuration, we are really overusing it there. And when we overuse it, what we do is we are creating more costs for our clients, because they have, not only they require we document this complexity, but we have to train their authors, and for that we also need to create documentation, and they need to pay for this. So how do we fix this problem? Because I don't like going to 1,000 or 2,000 lines of code and finding a configuration, or just adding one component so it's available in the parses. We try to rely on new features that will allow us to do this. This middle end concept with a different name was already introduced or suggested to us by Gabriel Waltz. He joined us in our summit in 2016. He's a product owner for Sites. And yeah, this is basically what he said. Like, we want to have a more dynamic and fluid dynamics between front-end developers and Java developers. So let's talk about content policies. Content policies is available from 6.3 with a feature pack that you should install, or in 6.4 if you get your hands on it, you can already play with this. I think, in fact, I think it's there from before, but if you have that, you ensure you can already implement this. What are content policies? Well, they are reusable design configuration for components. And I'll explain you why they are reusable. Because if you take a look at the We Retail implementation, which is the reference or the best practice recommendation from Adobe, we see that we will notice this new folder here that we already have in many of our projects in Netcentric now. And then we have a project-specific folder. We have settings, WCM, and then you will see these templates, policies, and template types. What are each one of these nodes doing there? Okay, the template types is where we are going to define base templates or base template types for a new role that Adobe has come with, the template authors, to create templates of them. Of course, at a developer level, we can do it as well programmatically. And then when we create a template of this template type, it will be stored here in the templates. And then we have the policies that rule over them. We can have policies at a local level, or we can have them globally. What is to notice is that the order of precedence is the local or the current folder, the parent of the current folder, then configuration global, then APPS, and finally libs. So we're going to explain how we map to policies that are outside of our folder. But first of all, let's explain what these other two nodes are. We have an initial and a structure folder here, right? So this is basically specifying what each node is of type. For example, the temple types, templates, and policies are CQ page. Inside of a CQ page as well, WCM settings, your folder conf all the way up. So the initial is for us to put the initial content and components we want to be on a page that is based off a component. The structure is to define as well components and content for the template that cannot be removed or deleted without merging them to an initial state. These components can be locked and unlocked, but every time you do, you are affecting anything you have created of your templates. So this is something to keep in mind. This is like a very dynamic system. This is why it's called dynamic templates. So when you use it, and I say it from now on, if you do, always proof of concept, your ideas, so you see what kind of, and experiment with them, so you see what kind of repercussions it may have on content, especially on published content. So okay, now we have initial, we have structure, and we can define policies. Policies can be defined at a template level or at a component level. What is the most obvious use of the policy at a template level? Well, in the page design, we could define a client library category that we would like to load for this template and any page based off it. If we were going to do it from the UI, and I recommend everyone that wants to use this gets acquainted with the UI because it's very useful. In many cases, it's more intuitive and you may want to go and use it and then download the package and adapt it and put it in your version control. Well, this is how it looks like. So you can define a policy, give it a name, give it a title and a description, and then set one client library or an array of them, and they will be, again, defined there. Then what is really also important is that policies can be shared across templates, so you don't have to define them every time. So you can define them once and then reference them or select them in the UI from this pull down. How do we do this? How can we share these policies across different locations, let's say? Well, we map them. So, oops, sorry. So, for example, if we were going to have in this path, like WCM Foundation component parsing, so for this component, we have a definition of policies called, for example, parses default. And if you see, I have blurred this out because this is from an actual project. So I would say that, okay, this is my, this is a policy, resource type policy, and I'm saying that in these parses that is in this path, I want all these components to be available or to be enabled. Well, this is my global policy. It's in the global folder. So then in the, for example, content page, I can, instead of defining all this again, I just say, okay, my parses has a policy that maps to this, and the resource type of this is policies mapping. So defining a policy for container components is mandatory because it's the one way to tell this part, for example, the parses is a container, what is allowed in it. But there are other things you can do with content policies, and it's not only about allowing components or not. That's the most used kind of policy, but you can do many other things with it. And for example, many of the complexity we were talking before that we put in the components edition, we can put it now in a policy. And what we need to do is, instead of creating a node of _CQ _dialog type, or name, sorry, we can create one of CQ design dialog and put property settings to it in exactly the same kind of syntax. And then we have it as a policy. So when you have properties defined for your component, you can also retrieve them programmatically, for example, with current style that foo, the name of your property, and use them in your implementations very easily. And this in the front end is very important because even when we are working on frameworks inside of AEM, we need the AEM properties. This is one of the pain points, to retrieve properties and data from AEM. So we can do it in this way. But like I was saying, not all shiny things are gold, and always check against your requirements, against your client's needs, and try to experiment before you really decide that you want to go with content policies. At least you need to be in Touch UI, because this doesn't work in Classic UI. So that's for sure one of the requirements. So if your client is still in Classic UI, well, this doesn't work for them. Okay, now we're going to go into something more. Anyone has a bit of track of the time? I think it's 30 minutes, but because of all the technical issues, I'm not really sure. The other feature I wanted to talk to you about that will also help us do better implementations and relying on AEM features is the style system. This is for sure only available with a feature pack or on 6.3, and it is meant to give components different visual appearances and functionality in an easier way than we are used to. Because in the past, when we were trying to grab a component, and let's say we had this component in a shared or dependency library, and we have 2 sub-projects, and we want to use the same components, okay, we could have different client libraries, more CSS code or whatever, but we always ended up with specificity issues, trying to override styles that were dependent, or we ended up using important a lot. I'm sure everyone has done this. Or we ended up doing expensive DOM manipulation in order to inject sometimes classes, depending on input, depending on configuration, or creating a very complex configuration logic in our JavaScript just to put a class in a determinate condition or context. But now we can do this with styles. So what is styles? Again, I had no idea about the system. So what I did is I registered to the beta program of Adobe, and I got my 6.4 and started experimenting with it. And the interesting thing for me, this is something we've been doing in the front end for a long time, only that this is much easier now, right? If you go to a component that has settings or is settings or policies enabled and supports it, you can then go to the policies and to the style tab, and then you can define, for example, a class that will be in the wrapper if you don't want to add any particular classes, or the default one. For example, in this case, I put base no style. And then you can also define more classes that may be added groupally or individually according to some concept you have in your mind. So for example, in this case, I decided that I'm going to have a group of styles that are called style page test, and that they're going to be available combined, so I can choose both at a time. And I defined one is the the size large, and another one the size red. Sorry, it should be color there, color red. And when you create a component or drop a component in the parses in a template that has this enabled, you will see this brush here that will display a drop-down for you to select these classes and apply them to your component. If you go to analyze or inspect your DOM, you will see this is a title component, and in the wrapper or the _CQ HTML decorator, you will see that the classes selected are applied, and it's as easy as that. Again, how did this work under the hood? I went to see, I'm just a front end, I wanted to see how AEM was implementing this. So when I went to the node in the content, the title, I saw that it had these CQ style IDs, some identifiers, numeric identifiers, but I didn't know where to look for them in the repository. So I ran a search for one of them after some advice, and okay, I see here the same content structure, and I see some CQ styles, one item 0 and item 2 that are CQ style classes of name, and in the value of a string have the class I just defined. So once you see this already, this representation in the CRX, you can already understand very intuitively how you can do this programmatically directly in the code and have these styles available for the content authors to use these styles. And then obviously you have to put JavaScript or CSS in your client libraries to make these classes do something, right? Okay, so then I got a question from somebody who asked me, okay, how can we leverage this style system with our Webpack build process? It's not easy because we don't know what the authors will put in a parses. So in fact, we need to have more or less everything available, and creating logics that will compile one or another, it's kind of complex. But if we were going to do something like this to begin with, we need to be working over HTTP2, because otherwise we would have too many requests, right? But what we can do is, just as we have an author category and a publish category, we could have potentially a styles category, and we could go back all the way to what we spoke about, client libraries being defined in policies, and we could say, okay, if we have a component that has styles, we could add this client library in particular to this template and only have this client library requested when it's truly necessary. Or we can also use content policy manager to retrieve properties and create tests, and also have these categories only downloaded when we really need them. So yes, I was going to speak about core components, but I'm not sure. Javi took track of the time. Ferran, already time for you? 5 minutos? Then all fine. Okay, so we were talking about all these nice things, but all these nice things, like said, need to be supported by the components. What can we do? Okay, we can write our own components and make them work with this, but there is no need to always reinvent the wheel, like I'm gonna say later. AEM is now making available to us a core version components already in the version 2 at the moment, which are components that provide a lot of flexibility, because you don't have to wait until a big release to get new features in a component. They make the components available on their own, and there are different packages, and you can install it. You can download it and install it on its own, and you don't need to really migrate your whole version. So this gives you more flexibility and more power to decide which version you want at every time, and even upgrade if necessary. So We had, for example, this requirement. We had a teaser gallery component. The requirement was to migrate it from legacy platform in Java 7, JSP, Classic UI, to new platform using Sling models, Java, HCL, and TouchUI. In the legacy platform, the resource supertype was foundation component lists, and in order to achieve all this migration, we leveraged core components and migrated to core component version 1 list and obtained exactly the same results with a lot less effort and the additional advantage of having dynamic templates compatibility and TouchUI out of the box and style system as well. So again, there is absolutely no need to reinvent the wheel every time. You can go to Adobe documentation and see that most of the bread and butter components, or a lot of them, are available as core components, and maybe they suit you. Maybe you see list, and this also serves as a teaser. You just have to try to marry your requirement with what is there. So, important, they require Java 8, they are only TouchUI, and they must not be directly referenced. To use the core components, you have to proxy them. So as per the proxy components pattern by Adobe. So thank you, this is all. I hope you can go and experiment, and now you have more ideas. And if you're a front-end tech lead or a back-end tech lead, you can think about this when you have a new requirement, and anybody in the team, really. So you can come up with great ideas, and you have to write less code, and you have more flexibility and less maintenance efforts. So thank you.